Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We've got huge developments tonight in two of the trials of Donald Trump. Just within the last half hour, Judge Tanya Chutkan, who was overseeing the federal criminal case about January 6th and the attempt to overturn the 2020 election, issued a withering rejection of the ex-president's attempt to get his criminal case thrown out of court. Trump and his lawyers had argued that he had total presidential immunity, and so the case should be dismissed outright. Chutkan rejected that argument, saying in part, quote, defendant's 4-year service as commander-in-chief did not bestow on him the divine right of kings to evade the criminal accountability that governs his fellow citizens. Now, this ruling in that criminal case comes today in the wake of a federal appeals court ruling that Donald Trump can face legal accountability for inciting the insurrection on January 6th in a civil case. That case brought by Capitol Police officers and lawmakers who sued Donald Trump back in 2021. As the Washington Post explains, they brought the suit under a roughly 150-year-old law designed to combat KKK violence after the Civil War. They argue Trump violated that statute, barring the use of force, threats, or intimidation to prevent government officials from carrying out their duties by conspiring with members of far-right groups to keep lawmakers from confirming the results of the 2020 election. Again, similarly, in that case, Donald Trump and his lawyers claimed that, as they had in the federal case to steal the election, that he had absolute immunity as president, that he could not be held civilly liable or accountable for his actions around the attempted coup. Now, all that is a clear embodiment of the dictatorial powers that Donald Trump wants to ascribe to the presidency, at least when he occupies it. While he was still in office, Trump repeatedly spoke about his absolute power to do whatever he likes.
I have the right to do whatever I want as president, but I don't even talk about that.
It gives me all of these rights at a level that nobody has ever seen before.
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be.
Total. The authority is total.
It's total.
After he left the White House, as the legal pressure increased, Trump zeroed in on this defense, declaring at the end of last year, quote, as president, I have total immunity. Just a few months ago, his lawyers in the federal elections case made the argument plainly on national television.
Everything that President Trump did was while he was in office as a president. He is now immune from prosecution for acts that he takes in connection with those policy decisions.
So according to Donald Trump and his lawyers, the president of the United States can just do whatever he wants. He can never be held accountable for any of it while he was of things he did while in office, even after he leaves office. This is Trump's view of presidential power. It is the view he will embody if he is reelected next year. It is the view that Judge Tanya Chutkan knocked down today in the federal criminal case, and the Circuit Court in Washington, D.C. also knocked down today in that civil case. The chief judge in that case explained, quote, when the president acts outside the functions of his office, he does not continue to enjoy immunity from damages liability just because he happens to be the president. When he acts in an unofficial private capacity, he is subject to civil suits like any private citizen. When a first-term president opts to seek a second term, his campaign to win re-election is not an official presidential act. And Trump himself recognized that he engaged in his campaign to win re-election, including his post-election efforts to alter the declared results in his favor, in his personal capacity as presidential candidate, not in his official capacity as sitting president. Now, to be clear on that civil case, right, the lawsuit, it's not the final ruling on the plaintiff's argument. Instead, it will allow the case to go forward, give them a chance to prove that Trump broke the law and that they were injured as a result. But again, in just 24 hours, right, both of these rulings, huge and hugely needed, providing some perspective on what actual judges think of Trump's claims of absolute and total immunity.